Hi everyone, this is chapter 30, Tragedy of the Commons, or the problem tragedy of the commons. So in this chapter, what we're talking about is this issue that arises with a common resource. And so what the tragedy of the commons is kind of a version or a type of externality. It's kind of a category of externality. Tragedy of the commons arises, like I said, so tragedy of the commons arises when we have shared resources and also when we have scarcity. So those are the two reasons that we can trace back the tragedy of the commons to. All right. So with this tragedy of the commons in chapter 30, Commercial Society, our book, goes through a little bit talking about the two problems, the 11th sheep versus the 11th shepherd. Okay. So let's talk about that a little bit. We have 11th sheep versus shepherd. So in this problem, we go on to kind of talk about how when we have the shared resource, how are we going about splitting up the shared resource? If there is scarcity, there's going to be an issue where demand might be higher than supply, or demand might be pushing past the capacity limit of the shared resource. Or another issue with the tragedy of the commons that arises is when someone overuses something that's supposed to be a communal shared resource, whatever it is. So the idea with this 11th sheep versus 11th shepherd is that we have this, let's say 100-foot, we have this 100-foot land, and in this 100-foot land, we have a capacity of 100 sheep, okay? And with those 100 sheep, we have 10 herders or 10 shepherds. So the land capacity is fine. When we have 10 herders with 10 sheep each, the land can sustain that 100 sheep. So the problem with the 11th sheep is when each of these herders, each of these 10 herders come back in and they say, okay, each of us want to now add an 11th sheep. So when each of them add 11 sheep, add one more sheep, we're going to have 10 more sheep than the land capacity can fit. And so in the book, it goes on to describe that because of this, it lowers the quality, lowers the value of these first 100 sheep by a very small amount. It's spread out between these 100 sheep. If each shepherd adds in one sheep, this externality, this tragedy of the commons is going to affect all 10 herders, all 10 shepherds, okay? So when we have this problem with the 11th shepherd, the problem is now not with 11 sheep per 10 herders. We're still going to have this issue with capacity. We're still going to have this capacity issue over here where this land can only sustain 100 sheep. But when we have 10 herders with 10 sheep each, and an 11th herder comes in, an 11th shepherd comes in, and they say, hey, I want to join this land. Can I bring my 10 sheep? So we still have 110 sheep within this land, and we're still over capacity by the same amount. But now in this case, this land, somebody has to step forward and say, okay, who's going to bear the burden of this cost, of this externality? Who is going to kind of bear that weight of those extra sheep? So in this case, if an 11th shepherd comes in, that 11th shepherd is going to bear that entire cost, because with this communal resource, they're going to have to turn this shepherd away. When each of the 10 shepherds add in one more sheep, once again, it's going to lower the value for each of the herders, but it's going to lower the value by a lot less than if just this 11th shepherd were to come in and bear the burden of the entire land capacity. All right. So because individuals almost always will act out of self-interest, the question in economics now is, how do we deal with these tragedies, the tragedy of the commons, with things like this in real life? Okay. Um, let's go through and do a few examples of different tragedies we see in real life. So the first example I think of is a community pool. And I guess I should have done these examples before we went on to talk about those sheep problem, but you can go ahead and rewind back to that now if after these examples, after we talk about it, if it makes more sense. So first example, like I said, I think of a community pool. So with this example, we have a very hard limit of literally a concrete limit to how many people can fit in this community pool. So when this community pool is shared for the entire community and it can fit 100 kids and that 101st kid comes and we can't fit him in the pool, him or her in the pool, what's going to happen? Who do we have to turn away? How do we determine who gets turned away? So that's the first example of a shared resource that might encounter some tragedy problem. Second, parking space. Once again, with parking space, it's only so limited. We only have so much space to be able to, in some areas, to be able to devote to parking. Another issue with this parking spot issue is when our parking spots are, maybe we have free parking within a community, within a town, that also encourages more people to drive. So that kind of encourages an overuse problem in and of itself, where free parking within a city will encourage driving when maybe driving may not be necessary. People may not have chosen driving otherwise. They're almost incentivized to drive and use this free parking. So parking in and of itself, once again, kind of is an issue, has this tragedy issue, but free parking spaces obviously are so limited. Water, so groundwater. I'm just going to start listing a few examples. Road space or traffic. So I say road space only because I think of literally the limits of the road and overusing the roads, which leads to that traffic issue. Another example that we saw at the beginning of COVID, face masks, where healthcare workers were actually facing a shortage because people were overusing this shared resource. And in this case, the face masks are usually private property. You have to go to the store and there is a cost to purchase them. But this shared resource was being overused by the public, by others. So healthcare workers, the people who needed them the most, they were facing shortage. So that's a real good issue or a real good example of that tragedy. All right. So moving on from those examples, let's talk a little bit more about what we can do, to prevent the tragedy of the commons. So we know government kind of steps in and sets certain policies in order to manage certain problems that arise that are similar, that are types of these tragedy of the common problems. So government's able to set certain regulations. They can come in and set policies. They can come in and say, all right, this is how we want things done, and they can enforce that. So government can come in and do that. Government can also tax certain things to persuade this tragedy problem. Government can tax certain things. They can subsidize certain things. So when we think of subsidies, I think of something that's underused. Government subsidizes when something is being underused, okay? And other ways government uses their power to kind of fix these tragedy problems. If we think about climate, we know that we have certain laws, certain enforcement agencies. We have the EPA, we have the Clean Air Act, and these are all ways that government comes in and tries to regulate these tragedy problems. So even though climate's a great example of these tragedy problems, because obviously we all live in a shared space, we all live on one earth. And so when certain companies or certain countries or firms or whatever it may be, are polluting more than others, everybody is going to feel the burden, even people who are not taking part in this transaction, in this trade, in this activity. People outside of that have nothing to do with this transaction are still feeling the impact or the externality from problems as such. So climate is a good example for that. Right. Another way we solve the tragedy problem is through property rights. So through property rights, a few examples of property rights, we have deeds to houses and cars and big purchases as such. We have land rights. We have pollution regulations where companies can only pollute up to a certain amount. We have patents. So these are all examples of different types of property rights that try to kind of get at that tragedy problem, okay? All of these are examples where we are able to enforce or we have a protected right to our goods, whatever it may be. When we say something is private property, we know it's ours. We have that right to our property, all right? So other solutions other than kind of regulations, property rights, other solutions to this tragedy problem, there is a section in our books talking about communal management. So if you've ever heard of the term commune, you think of, I know my first thought is a group of people living together, working together to create an environment where it's self-sustainable, okay? When I think commune, I think kind of that everybody is working together attitude. And when you join a commune, that's the expectation that when you're accepted into a commune, you're going to contribute your part to the self-sustaining lifestyle. So same thing with communal management. That's, like I said, one other solution to the tragedy problem when we have this overused shared resource. So communal management, if we think about that shepherding problem or the shepherd problem again, communal management would come in and say, okay, this entire land can be used by everybody. And we're all going to take part in our 100 sheep. Okay, so we put everything together and everybody lends a hand in creating whatever that our common goal. When we have communes, the one problem we run into that is not exactly an issue, a tragedy of the commons issue. It's actually called an open access problem. So what this open access problem is when we have a commune, and we go back to that 11 sheep problem, we have a commune. How are we, if we have land that can sustain 100 sheep and we already have 100 sheep in our commune, how do we turn down others' access to this commune? How do we say, sorry, you're not able to join this commune when the goal of this commune is to accept everyone, to be able to share this land, to break it up evenly? So really, this whole chapter, the big thing about this chapter, the main takeaway is that this tragedy problem is always going to be overuse of some shared resource. It is an example of a type of externality, and government has a hard time controlling these tragedy problems because there's no one right way to solve this. All right, so if there are any questions, please feel free to reach out. I believe that's all I had for the most part for this chapter. All right, thank you again. And stay tuned for the next few chapters.